October 1944. A biting wind whips through the Hürtgen forest, stripping the last leaves from the skeletal trees. Private Frank Miller of the 28th Infantry Division hunches deeper into his foxhole, the damp earth offering little comfort against the cold. His M1 helmet, a heavy, familiar dome of manganese steel, feels like an extension of his skull. He pulls it lower, shielding his eyes from the drizzle. The canvas chin strap, stiff with dried mud and sweat, hangs loose, swaying gently with his movements. It always did. Frank never buckled his helmet. Few did. This wasn't a unique oversight, a forgotten detail in the chaos of war. It was a silent, widespread defiance of design, a uniform practice observed by millions of American soldiers across every front, from the frozen Ardennes to the sweltering South Pacific. The M1 helmet, a marvel of wartime engineering, the very symbol of Allied resolve, was worn. But its most basic safety feature, the chin strap, was almost universally ignored. It seems absurd. In a war where every ounce of protection mattered, where a fragment of shrapnel could mean the difference between life and oblivion, why would seasoned combat veterans deliberately choose to compromise their own defense? The answer isn't simple, nor is it officially recorded in any tactical manual. It's a story of unexpected physics, battlefield realities, and the grim calculus of survival. The M1 helmet itself was a product of urgent necessity and meticulous design. By 1940, as the world plunged into its second global conflict, the U.S. Army was still largely equipped with the antiquated M1917 Brodie helmet, a relic of the Great War. Its shallow, bowl-like shape offered minimal protection, and its uncomfortable leather liner was prone to rot. Lieutenant Colonel William A. Gagnon, head of the Infantry Board, pushed for a radical overhaul. He wanted something that offered maximum ballistic protection, was comfortable for extended wear, and could be mass-produced with wartime speed. The result, after rapid prototyping and extensive testing, was the M1. It weighed just under 3 pounds, a significant improvement over its predecessors, and consisted of 2 parts, a heavy steel outer shell and a lighter, fiber-based inner liner. This ingenious 2-piece design allowed the liner to be worn separately for non-combat duties, or to be fitted with various accessories, from headlamps to camouflage netting. Its deep, rounded shape covering the ears and nape of the neck was a vast improvement in protection, and crucial to its design was a robust, adjustable canvas chin strap, intended to keep the helmet firmly in place during movement or impact. On paper, it was flawless. On the proving grounds, it was a triumph. Yet, from the moment the first M1s shipped out to training camps in 1941, a quiet, unofficial modification began. Soldiers, almost instinctively, began to leave their chin straps unbuckled, or even cut them off entirely. The officers, at first, were baffled. Regulations explicitly stated the strap should be fastened. Drill sergeants barked orders. But the practice persisted, a stubborn, almost superstitious ritual passed down from veteran to rookie. This wasn't about comfort. The strap was relatively unobtrusive. This wasn't about defiance for defiance's sake. It was about something far more primal, a gut feeling that quickly calcified into an unwritten rule. The problem, as many quickly discovered, lay not in the helmet's ability to protect, but in a very specific and terrifying scenario. A direct hit from artillery or a mortar round, even a near miss, could generate an immense concussive force. The M1 was designed to withstand shrapnel and direct bullet impacts, but a powerful blast wave was a different beast entirely. If the helmet was buckled tightly, that concussive force, instead of simply dislodging the helmet, could transmit directly to the wearer's jaw and neck. The consequences, soldiers learned, were often catastrophic: a broken neck, a fractured jaw, or, more commonly, a sudden, violent whipping motion that could snap the head back, causing severe trauma to the brainstem. The irony was brutal. The very strap designed to keep the helmet on your head could, in the worst-case scenario, amplify the damage from an impact, turning a survivable blow into a fatal one. It was a macabre trade-off, a chilling calculation that soldiers made in the field, far from the drawing boards and ballistic labs. They understood that losing a helmet in the heat of battle was a risk, but the risk of a broken neck from a blast wave, amplified by a buckled strap, was a far more immediate and terrifying prospect. This unspoken understanding spread like wildfire through the ranks, quickly becoming ingrained in the culture of the fighting man. It was a choice born of brutal experience, a re-engineering of survival tactics on the fly. But the story of why this became such a universal practice and the true extent of its impact goes far deeper than a simple fear of neck injuries. The deeper impact wasn't solely physical. It was a profound psychological shift, a subtle, constant defiance of official protocol. This unwritten rule, a silent acknowledgement that the front lines operated by a different, more brutal logic than any training manual, created a distinct cultural marker. It became a silent badge of a veteran, a man who had faced the blast and understood its true, insidious nature. New recruits, fresh from basic training, where every strap was cinched tight, would observe the older, more hardened soldiers. They'd watch as these men, with weary eyes and a fatalistic shrug, would simply let their chin straps hang loose, or tuck them under the rim, just enough to prevent a total loss, but never buckled. They quickly adopted the habit, not needing a lecture, but simply observing the silent wisdom passed down through the ranks. It was an initiation, a grim lesson in survival, learned not from a drill sergeant, but from the very battlefield itself. Officially, the doctrine was unwavering. The chin strap must be fastened. Field manuals were explicit, their pages filled with diagrams showing the M1 helmet secured snugly beneath the chin. Photographs from stateside training camps invariably depicted soldiers in perfect formation, their helmets buckled, a symbol of discipline and readiness. But the reality in the combat zones, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, was a stark contrast. Command, from company captains to regimental colonels, found themselves in an impossible dilemma. To enforce the rule vigorously would be to directly contradict the lived experience of their men, to undermine a coping mechanism that, however unorthodox, seemed to save lives. It wasn't an order, it was a silent pact, an unspoken understanding between those who fought and those who led them into the fight. Many officers, having shared the same brutal experiences, often turned a blind eye, knowing the reasons were etched into the very soil they stood upon. It was a compromise, a tacit admission that some rules, born in the abstract of a design lab, simply couldn't withstand the concrete realities of war. To fully grasp this paradox, we must briefly step back to the helmet's inception. The M1 helmet, introduced in 1941, was a revolutionary design, a monumental leap forward from the shallow, less protective, Brody-style helmets of World War I. Its deep, rounded shape and manganese steel construction offered superior ballistic protection against shrapnel and direct rifle fire, covering significantly more of the head and neck. It was a triumph of metallurgical engineering and practical design, meticulously tested against projectiles in controlled environments. The primary threat modeled was shrapnel, flying metal. But these rigorous tests rarely, if ever, simulated the chaotic multi-vector forces of a high-explosive blast. The sheer, sudden pressure changes, the invisible hammer blow of a concussive wave, was an unforeseen variable, a blind spot in an otherwise brilliant design. The chin strap itself, a simple yet robust piece of webbing, was designed with a singular purpose: to keep the helmet firmly in place during rapid movement, during a dive into a foxhole, or even during minor impacts. It was a logical, almost intuitive addition, ensuring the helmet stayed precisely where it was needed to offer protection. No one in the design phase could have anticipated that this very security, this firm anchorage, could become a liability when confronted with the immense, sudden pressure changes generated by a nearby explosion. Imagine a soldier dug into a shallow foxhole, his face pressed to the dirt, as a mortar round lands just yards away. The blast wave hits, an invisible crushing wall of force. If the helmet is buckled, it acts like a rigid lever, a fixed point of impact. That concussive force, instead of simply dislodging the helmet, transmits directly downwards, wrenching the head, snapping the neck, or fracturing the jaw. If unbuckled, the helmet might indeed fly off, a metallic clang as it tumbles away. But the head, momentarily free of that rigid anchor, could absorb the shock more fluidly, minimizing the whiplash effect on the brainstem and cervical spine. It was a choice between losing a helmet or potentially losing your life, or worse, suffering a debilitating injury that might leave you a burden to your comrades. This wasn't a perfect solution, of course. An unbuckled helmet could still lead to head injuries from falling debris, from a direct bullet impact once the helmet was dislodged, or even from the sheer force of a fall. Losing your helmet in the heat of battle meant momentary vulnerability, a frantic scramble to retrieve it, or the desperate search for a replacement. But in the grim, unforgiving calculus of the battlefield, soldiers weighed these risks. A helmet that flew off meant a brief, terrifying exposure. A buckled helmet in a blast zone meant a high probability of a severe, debilitating, or fatal neck or brain injury, a life-altering trauma. The choice, for many, became chillingly clear, driven by the immediate terror of internal trauma versus the external, visible threat of a lost helmet. This wasn't a brave choice, nor a cowardly one. It was a pragmatic, almost scientific adaptation, a desperate attempt to tip the odds, however slightly, in their favor against an enemy that respected no rules of engagement. The practice spread not through official dispatches or training exercises, but through whispers, through observations, and through the grim, irrefutable evidence of the wounded. A medic tending to a soldier with a broken neck would note the tightly buckled strap, the telltale sign of a blast injury. A veteran, recounting a near-death experience, would emphasize how his helmet had flown off, leaving him dazed and disoriented, but otherwise physically intact. These were the anecdotes that built the legend, the unwritten law that superseded all regulations, etched into the collective memory of the fighting man. It became a part of the soldier's lore, as essential as cleaning your rifle or digging a deeper foxhole. It was a secret language, understood by all who had seen the elephant, a silent code of survival. Yet, this widespread defiance of a basic safety protocol posed a larger, unaddressed question for the military high command, one that transcended individual choice. How could they reconcile official doctrine with a practice that was clearly saving lives, but simultaneously introducing other, equally dangerous risks. And what were the long-term, unacknowledged costs of this silent rebellion? A rebellion born not of insubordination, but of the raw, desperate will to survive. The silence from command was not born of ignorance. It was a slow, dawning realization, pieced together not from frontline reports of insubordination, but from the sterile, grim statistics filtering back from aid stations and field hospitals. Medical officers, compiling casualty data, began to notice a disturbing trend. While head wounds from direct shrapnel hits remained tragically consistent, there was an unexpected spike in severe neck and spinal injuries among soldiers who had been exposed to close proximity concussive blasts, and almost universally, these helmets were found securely buckled. Conversely, soldiers with concussions or superficial head wounds often had their helmets found meters away, unbuckled, sometimes cracked, but their necks intact. This was not anecdotal evidence from a single platoon. These were patterns emerging across divisions, across campaigns, from North Africa to Sicily, then across the beaches of Normandy. Lieutenant Colonel James F. Smith, a medical statistician attached to the Surgeon General's office in Washington, D.C., first flagged the anomaly in late 1943. His initial report, a dry tabulation of injury types versus helmet strap status, was met with bureaucratic skepticism. Correlation does not imply causation, a superior officer noted, dismissing the data as mere coincidence or perhaps even an indicator of poor helmet maintenance. But Smith persisted. He wasn't a hero, just a meticulous man with an obsession for numbers. He cross-referenced his data with blast radius reports, with types of explosive devices, even with witness testimonies where available. The pattern held. The blast wave, a sudden, immense pressure, would snap a buckled helmet against the wearer's chin or jaw, transmitting the full, unmitigated force directly to the cervical spine. An unbuckled helmet, however, would be ripped away, often before the peak force hit, dissipating much of the energy and protecting the neck, even if it left the head vulnerable to lesser impacts or the confusion of a concussion. The implications were profound and deeply uncomfortable. The very safety device designed to protect was, in specific circumstances, exacerbating a different, often more catastrophic injury. The military faced an impossible dilemma. To officially sanction the unbuckling of helmets would be an admission of a design flaw, a public relations nightmare, and a potential legal liability in a post-war world. It would also be seen as encouraging a practice that undeniably left soldiers more vulnerable to direct head trauma. Yet, to ignore the statistics, to continue to mandate a practice that was demonstrably leading to severe neck injuries, felt morally indefensible to those few who understood the data. No general issued a sweeping order. No Grand Council convened to debate the fate of the chin strap. Instead, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift occurred. Training films, while still depicting proper helmet wear, began to subtly de-emphasize the strap. Field manuals, while never explicitly altering the regulation, started featuring illustrations where straps were less prominent or even obscured. There was no official memo, no directive from the Pentagon. It was an unspoken understanding, a tacit acknowledgement of battlefield reality overriding textbook theory. The High Command, faced with an unpalatable truth, chose not to confront it head-on, but to allow the silent rebellion to continue, to become an unofficial doctrine of survival. They made the choice to look away, to let the soldiers decide individually, on the ground, what their lives were worth and how they would try to keep them. But this silent compromise came with its own hidden costs, costs that would not be fully tallied until long after the last shot was fired and the veterans came home. What exactly were these costs, beyond the immediate battlefield injuries, and how did they reshape not just military doctrine, but the lives of those who bore the scars of this unspoken choice? The hidden costs were insidious, far removed from the immediate brutal tally of the battlefield. For those who survived, the decision to unbuckle, a choice made in a split second between life and death, often carried a quieter, heavier burden home. They returned not just with the visible scars of conflict, but with an intimate understanding of the fragility of regulations, the stark chasm between the ideal and the impossible reality of combat. The official records, meticulously kept, would never account for the precise mechanism of their survival, nor the specific injuries averted by their unofficial defiance. The meticulous reports of the Army Medical Corps, focused on shell fragments and bullet wounds, could not capture the subtle, unseen damage. Instead, the long-term consequences manifested in ways that were difficult to trace directly back to a chin strap. The subtle, repeated concussive forces, even without direct impact to the head, could contribute to what later generations would understand as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a slow, insidious thief of memory and clarity. The neck strains, the whiplash effects from near misses, the constant tension of holding one's head in an unnatural way to keep the helmet stable during movement. These were not bullet wounds, but they were wounds nonetheless. They were the persistent aches in the joints on a cold morning, the headaches that never quite left, the quiet tremors that sometimes began years later. These were the costs borne silently, often dismissed by a post-war medical system ill-equipped to connect a soldier's chronic pain to a decision made under enemy fire, a decision that, in that moment, had undeniably saved their life. The paradox was cruel, almost unbearable. Survival often meant accepting a different kind of injury, a slow burn instead of a sudden explosion. And for many, the very act of making such a choice, of overriding months of training for raw instinct, ingrained a deeper sense of self-reliance, perhaps even a quiet distrust of authority that lingered for decades. They learned to trust their gut, their comrades, the immediate, undeniable evidence of their senses, not always the manual or the distant command. This wasn't a lesson learned from a textbook. It was etched into their bones by the sound of incoming fire, by the visceral memory of a friend whose neck snapped from a simple fall while his helmet was rigidly secured. The quiet rebellion of the unbuckled chin strap became a symbol, not of recklessness or insubordination, but of an intimate, practical intelligence born of immediate necessity. It spoke to the countless small, unauthorized adaptations made by soldiers in every theater, on every front, the extra sandbags piled on a jeep for improvised armor, the torn parachute silk used as makeshift camouflage, the shared rations that defied strict logistical orders. These were the true gears of the war machine, turning not by grand strategic design, but by the relentless, often desperate ingenuity of individuals trying to survive another day, to protect the man beside them. When the war ended, these men, who had made countless such personal, life-or-death decisions, returned to their towns and cities. They did not speak of the chin-strap dilemma. It was too small, too specific, too personal, too mundane, perhaps, to articulate in the grand narratives of victory and sacrifice that filled the newspapers and the airwaves. They simply went on with their lives, built families, pursued careers, and carried their silent costs, their unspoken compromises. The official histories, the Hollywood films, would continue to show soldiers with buckled helmets, pristine and correct, just as the manuals dictated. But the reality, lived and breathed in the mud and blood of battlefields from Normandy to Okinawa, was far more nuanced, far more human, and ultimately far more resilient. The legacy of the unbuckled helmet, therefore, is not found in a change of regulation, nor in a posthumous commendation. It is found in the quiet resilience of those who understood that survival sometimes demands a break from the rules, a redefinition of safety. It is a testament to the anonymous wisdom of the front line, a whispered truth passed between comrades, a potent reminder that the greatest battles are often fought and won, not by generals, but in the smallest, most personal choices of ordinary men. Men who simply found a way to come home,